The grease trap at the Sunrise Cafe always smelled faintly of burnt onions and despair, but to Grant Foster, it smelled like an honest living. He was wiping down the stainless steel counter, his apron stained with a grueling 12-hour shift, when Brian, his neighbor from across the duplex, sat at the empty counter. Brian didn't order his usual black coffee. He just stared at his calloused hands, swallowed hard, and whispered the words that would dismantle Grant's entire reality. "Grant, I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but I saw Riley's car parked behind the Riverside apartments yesterday. A guy got in. They didn't look like they were just talking." Grant's hand stopped. Riley had sworn she was picking up extra shifts to pay for the broken water heater. A cold sweat broke over him, a sickening intuition that the life he was breaking his back to build was already gone. If stories of hidden betrayals, the heavy cost of the truth, and the painful unraveling of a marriage speak to your heart, stay with me. The Sunrise Cafe was not the kind of place people went for the ambience. It was a place for truckers bleeding off the highway, construction workers looking for cheap calories, and locals who didn't want to drink alone. For Grant Foster, it was the center of the universe. The heat radiating from the flat-top grill was oppressive, settling into his pores and making his gray t-shirt cling to his back. At 34, Grant looked 40. Years of flipping burgers, inhaling aerosolized grease, and working double shifts to keep his head above water had carved deep lines around his eyes. He scraped a layer of charred meat off the iron surface, the rhythmic shhk of his spatula the only sound anchoring him to the present. Through the pass-through window, he could see the dining room. It was 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, the dead zone between the lunch rush and the early dinner crowd. He looked for Riley. She wasn't there. His wife was supposed to be doing inventory in the back room. They had been married for 7 years, a union forged in the fires of shared poverty and a stubborn determination to build a life out of nothing. She was the one who managed the front. He ruled the kitchen. They were a team, or so he told himself every morning when the alarm blared at 4:30 a.m. The bell above the diner's front door chimed. Grant looked up, expecting a straggler wanting a late club sandwich. Instead, Brian Cooper walked in. Brian was their neighbor from the duplex across the street, a quiet, retired mechanic who spent his days sitting on his porch, nursing light beers and watching the world go by. He was a good man, the kind who lent Grant his snowblower without being asked. But today, Brian didn't look right. He walked past the open booths and sat directly at the counter, right in front of the pass-through window. "Hey, Brian," Grant said, wiping his brow with the back of his forearm. "The usual? Black, 2 sugars?" Brian didn't meet his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the laminated menu trapped beneath the sugar caddy. "No, Grant. No coffee today." Grant stopped wiping the counter. The tone in the older man's voice was unnervingly heavy. "Everything okay? The mower acting up again?" Brian let out a slow, ragged breath. He rubbed his calloused hands together, his knuckles white. He looked up, his eyes filled with a profound, reluctant sorrow. "Grant, you know I respect you. You're a hardworking guy. You don't deserve to look like a fool." The ambient noise of the diner, the hum of the refrigerators, the distant clatter of silverware from the busboy, seemed to drop away. A cold prickle washed over Grant's skin, completely at odds with the 100-degree heat of the kitchen. "What are you talking about, Brian?" Grant asked, his voice low, cautious. "Yesterday," Brian started, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was over by the Riverside apartments, picking up some parts from my buddy's garage. I saw your car, Grant. The blue Honda. Riley took the Honda yesterday," Grant said automatically, a defensive reflex kicking in. "She had to run to the restaurant supply store over in Cicero. The supplier messed up our napkin order." Brian shook his head slowly, miserably. "She wasn't in Cicero, Grant. She was parked behind Building C. I wouldn't have thought anything of it. Maybe she was visiting a friend." But Brian swallowed hard, finally forcing himself to meet Grant's eyes. A guy came out of the stairwell. He got into the passenger seat. "Grant, they didn't look like they were just talking. They were close." Real close. Before she drove off, I saw him lean over the console. The spatula slipped from Grant's fingers, clattering loudly against the stainless steel prep table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet diner. "You're mistaken," Grant said immediately. His heart was suddenly hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. "You saw wrong. The sun was in your eyes, or it was someone else's car. There are a million blue Civics in Chicago, Brian. It had the dent on the rear bumper, Grant. The one you tried to pop out with the boiling water last month." Brian stood up, looking physically sick to his stomach. "I'm sorry, son. I really am. I just thought you had the right to know." Brian turned and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming a cheerful, mocking note behind him. Grant stood frozen behind the grill. The smell of burning grease suddenly made him want to vomit. He looked toward the back hallway. The heavy metal door to the inventory room was closed. Riley was in there, his wife, his partner. He looked down at his trembling hands. A seed of doubt, dark and poisonous, had just been planted in his chest, and he knew with terrifying certainty that his life was never going to be the same. The fluorescent light in their duplex kitchen flickered, casting a sickly, pale hue over the peeling linoleum floor. It was past midnight. The air in the small room was heavy with the smell of old cooking oil that seemed to seep from their very pores. Riley sat at the chipped formica table, mechanically sorting a crumpled pile of $1 bills and quarters from her apron. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of a 12-hour shift. Grant stood by the sink, a glass of tap water in his hand, watching her. For the past 8 hours at the diner, he had swallowed his panic, burying it beneath a mountain of incoming orders. But now, in the quiet suffocation of their home, the silence was deafening. "Brian came into the cafe this afternoon," Grant said. His voice sounded painfully loud in the small room. Riley didn't look up. She smoothed out a wrinkled $5 bill with her thumb. "Yeah? Tell him to fix his muffler. It wakes me up every time he leaves for the hardware store." Grant tightened his grip on the glass. "He didn't come in to eat. He came to talk to me about yesterday, when you took the Honda." Riley's hands stopped moving. It was a microscopic pause, a brief suspension of breath, before she resumed stacking the coins. "What about it? I told you I went to the supply depot in Cicero. Brian said he saw the car parked behind the Riverside apartments," Grant continued, his chest tightening. "He said you picked someone up. A man, he said. He said it looked intimate." Riley slowly raised her head. Her eyes, usually a soft, tired brown, hardened into dark flint. She didn't flinch. She didn't stutter. Instead, a deep, weary sigh escaped her lips, morphing into a bitter scoff. "Are you kidding me right now, Grant?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You're interrogating me? Over the rambling of an old man who drinks his lunch on his front porch?" He was completely sober, Riley. He noticed the dent on the rear bumper. He was certain. Riley stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. The exhaustion she carried suddenly transformed into a shield of righteous indignation. "There are 100 beat-up blue Civics in this zip code. Do you know what I was doing yesterday, Grant? I was standing in a warehouse office in Cicero for 2 hours, begging the regional manager to let us slide on a late payment for the napkins and to-go boxes. Because if I didn't, we wouldn't have stock for the weekend rush." She closed the distance between them, her presence overwhelming in the cramped kitchen. "Look at me," she demanded. "Do I look like a woman who has the time or the energy to have an affair? I am on my feet for 12 hours a day dealing with creeps who leave 50-cent tips. I come home, I wash your grease-stained clothes, and I try to figure out how we're going to pay the electric bill." Grant felt the ground shift beneath him, the absolute conviction in her voice, the physical evidence of her exhaustion. It all made him feel incredibly small. Her expression softened from anger to a bruised, profound disappointment. She reached out, her fingertips gently touching the rough cotton of his shirt. "Grant, we are drowning. We only have each other to rely on. If you're going to let a bored, lonely neighbor put ideas in your head, If you really think I'm betraying you after everything we've sacrificed. Her voice cracked. Then what is the point of all this? The guilt hit Grant like a physical blow. He looked at his wife, at the dark circles under her eyes, and hated himself for doubting her. He had no proof, only a whispered rumor that threatened to tear down the fragile life they were holding together with bare hands. I'm sorry, Grant whispered, pulling her into a hesitant embrace. I'm just tired.
I'm sorry.
Riley rested her chin on his shoulder, her hands rubbing his back in a slow, comforting rhythm. It's okay. We're both just exhausted. Grant closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of her cheap coconut shampoo. He had surrendered, but as he held his wife in the flickering kitchen light, the cold, heavy knot in his stomach refused to untie. The days that followed were a masterclass in pretending. Grant worked the grill with mechanical precision, his spatula a blur of silver against the black iron. He smiled when Riley squeezed his shoulder in passing. He ate the cold meatloaf she brought home without complaint. He played the part of the reassured husband flawlessly. But the doubt was a living thing now, a parasite coiled tight in his gut, feeding on every minor discrepancy. It started with the schedule. For 3 years, Riley had fought tooth and nail for the Friday night shifts at the Sunrise Cafe. It was the only night the tips were thick enough to actually make a dent in their mounting credit card debt. But on Wednesday morning, Grant noticed the dry erase board in the cramped employee break room. Riley had swapped her Friday night with Michelle, the college girl who usually worked the sluggish Thursday afternoon slot. When he asked her about it over a bowl of cheap cereal in their kitchen, her answer came just a fraction of a second too fast. Michelle needed the extra cash for textbooks, she had said, not looking up from her black coffee. And I could use a Thursday afternoon to just sleep. My lower back is killing me, Grant. It was a plausible excuse. It was even kind. But it was the way she held her ceramic mug, her knuckles turning a faint, pale white, that made Grant's stomach drop. Riley wasn't running a charity. They were 3 weeks late on the gas bill. She would never give up a Friday night for a coworker's textbooks. Then came the Honda. It was Grant's turn to take the car to the discount grocer on Thursday morning before his shift. The interior smelled faintly of stale vanilla air freshener and damp floor mats. He turned the key, listening to the familiar, sluggish whine of the starter. Out of habit, he glanced at the dashboard gauge. He had filled the tank to the brim on Sunday night, hitting the trip reset button as he always did to track their gas consumption. Since then, the car had only been driven from their duplex to the cafe, and Riley's supposed run to the Cicero Supply Depot on Monday afternoon. The cafe was 3 miles away. The depot in Cicero was 12. The math was simple. The trip meter should have read somewhere around 35 miles. It read 78. Grant stared at the glowing green numbers, the engine idling roughly beneath him. 43 miles were unaccounted for. He sat in the cracked concrete driveway, the cheap plastic steering wheel sticky beneath his palms, tracing the geography of the Chicago suburbs in his mind. The Riverside Apartments, the complex where Brian claimed to have seen her, was exactly 20 miles west of their duplex. A round trip, accounting for a few wrong turns or looking for parking, would be just over 40 miles. He turned the engine off. The sudden silence in the cabin was suffocating. He looked over at the passenger seat. It was meticulously clean. There were no stray hairs, no forgotten sunglasses, no blatant clues left behind. Riley was careful, but she couldn't erase the digital memory of the distance the car had traveled. He rested his forehead against the top of the steering wheel, squeezing his eyes shut against the harsh morning sun filtering through the windshield. His chest ached with a hollow, physical pain. He wanted to march back into the duplex, wake her up, and demand the truth. But he remembered the cold, terrifying conviction in her eyes during their last fight. She would have another excuse. She would explain away the mileage with a wrong turn or a detour for cheap groceries. She would make him feel crazy and controlling all over again. If he was going to tear his own life apart, he couldn't do it with basic math and a neighbor's gossip. He needed something absolute, something she couldn't gaslight her way out of. Thursday morning arrived with a suffocating, humid heat that clung to the Chicago suburbs like a damp towel. It was Grant's single day off from the Sunrise Cafe, a day usually reserved for collapsing on their second-hand sofa and nursing his chronically aching lower back. Instead, he was in the cracked asphalt driveway, lying on a flattened piece of cardboard beneath the 2012 Honda Civic. The smell of old motor oil and hot pavement filled his nostrils. He wrenched the drain plug loose, letting the black, sludgy fluid bleed into the plastic pan resting on his chest. It was a chore he hated, but paying a mechanic $40 for an oil change was a luxury they simply could not afford. Not when the electric company was threatening to cut their power by the end of the month. He slid out from under the chassis, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag that was already stiff with dirt. He needed to pop the hood to pour the fresh oil in. Grant opened the driver's side door, the hinges groaning in protest, and leaned across the worn fabric seat to reach the release lever. As he pulled back out, his elbow bumped the rearview mirror, knocking it askew. He reached up to adjust it. His hand froze in mid-air. Tucked neatly behind the mirror, its small, square black casing blending into the dark tint of the upper windshield, was the dashcam. Grant stared at it. His breathing slowed, the oppressive heat of the morning suddenly forgotten. He had bought the cheap, $30 device off the internet 8 months ago, right after a distracted teenager had rear-ended Riley at a stoplight. The insurance company had tried to split the fault, and Grant had sworn they would never be caught without evidence again. He had spent an entire Sunday cursing as he tucked the thin black wire into the headliner, routing it down the A-pillar to the cigarette lighter. Once it was installed, it became invisible, part of the background noise of their cluttered, exhausted lives. They never looked at it. They never touched it. It just sat there, automatically turning on with the ignition, recording in continuous loops, overwriting the oldest files when the memory card filled up. Grant's heart began to hammer a heavy, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He remembered standing in the driveway with Brian, proudly demonstrating how the cheap little camera worked. He remembered the specific detail he had bragged about, the feature that now made the blood roar in his ears. It doesn't just record the road, Brian. It has a microphone. It records audio inside the cabin, too. The Honda was their only car. It was the car Riley took to run errands. It was the car she had driven on Monday when Brian saw her behind the Riverside apartments. It was the car that had logged 43 mysterious miles. The small black box was no longer just a piece of plastic and glass. It was a silent, impartial witness. It had been riding shotgun with his wife, listening to every breath, every phone call, every conversation. Grant remained entirely still, his hand hovering inches from the device. To pull the memory card was an act of profound violation. It was an admission that their marriage was fundamentally broken, that the trust they had built over 7 years of scraping by had evaporated into nothing. If he looked, he could never unlook. He would cross a boundary from which there was no return. He thought of Riley's fierce, tearful indignation in the kitchen. He thought of her working double shifts, her feet swollen, her eyes dark with fatigue. But then he thought of the 78 miles on the odometer. With a trembling hand, Grant reached up. His grease-stained thumb pressed against the tiny, spring-loaded slot on the side of the camera. There was a soft, mechanical click. The microSD card popped out. Grant pinched it between his fingers and pulled it free. It was no larger than a fingernail, weightless in his palm, yet as he closed his fist around it, it felt heavier than a stone. The duplex was entombed in a suffocating 2 a.m. silence. The only illumination in the cramped living room came from the harsh, blue-white glare of Grant's battered Dell laptop. Through the thin, dry wall of their bedroom, he could hear the rhythmic, even breathing of his wife. Riley was dead to the world, exhausted from a double shift that had ended just before 10. Grant sat at the wobbly coffee table, his calloused fingers hovering over the trackpad. Beside the laptop lay the tiny, black microSD card. It had taken him hours to build the courage to bring it inside. He had walked aimlessly around the neighborhood, the humid night air doing nothing to cool the fever burning in his mind. Now he was here, the point of no return. He slid the card into the USB adapter and pushed it into the side of the computer. The machine whirred loudly, the cooling fan struggling to process the sudden influx of data. A folder appeared on the screen, DCIM. Grant opened it. Hundreds of video files populated the window, neatly arranged by date and time in 3-minute increments. He scrolled past the weekend files. They had driven to the discount grocer together on Sunday. Nothing there. He moved down to Monday, the day Brian had knocked the axis of his world off its center. He found the block of files starting at 2 p.m. His throat was entirely dry. He clicked the first video. The media player opened. The visual was useless. Just a static shot of the Honda's hood and the passing gray asphalt of suburban Chicago. But Grant didn't care about the video. He closed his eyes and focused entirely on the tinny speakers of the laptop. File 1405. The rhythmic clicking of the turn signal. The hum of the tires. The local pop station playing softly in the background. Riley clearing her throat. Mundane. File 1423. The engine shutting off. The heavy clunk of the driver's side door. Silence. She was out of the car. Grant's heart hammered a sickening beat against his ribs. He checked the timestamps, skipping ahead until he found the moment the engine flared back to life. File 1542. The visual showed the cracked brick wall of what looked like the back of an apartment building. The Riverside Apartments. Grant leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The audio hissed with static, followed by the heavy thump of the passenger door opening and slamming shut. The car's suspension creaked under a sudden, new weight. Grant pressed his hands flat against the coffee table, bracing himself for an impact he knew was coming but could not evade. A rustle of clothing. A soft, breathless sigh from Riley. And then, a voice cut through the cheap laptop speakers. "You're late," a man said. It wasn't a stranger asking for directions. It wasn't a coworker needing a ride. The tone was relaxed, low, and laced with a terrifying, casual intimacy. It was the voice of a man who belonged exactly where he was sitting. "I had to wait for the lunch rush to die down before I could slip away," Riley's voice answered. She didn't sound exhausted. She didn't sound like the woman who dragged herself through the door of their duplex every night complaining about her aching back and the crushing weight of their bills. She sounded entirely alive. Her voice held a playful, light timbre that Grant hadn't heard in years. "I was starting to think you changed your mind," the man murmured. The audio picked up the distinct sound of fabric shifting, of worn leather seats creaking as someone leaned across the center console. "I never change my mind," Riley whispered. Grant slammed his palm against the spacebar, pausing the playback. The silence crashed back into the living room, deafening and absolute. He stared at the frozen frame of the brick wall on the screen. The air in his lungs felt like crushed glass. He had the proof. The gaslighting, the perfect lies, the exhaustion. It was all a beautifully constructed mask. The woman sleeping 20 feet away was a stranger, and the life Grant was breaking his back to maintain was nothing but a ghost story. Grant's finger hovered over the spacebar of the battered Dell laptop. The screen was still frozen on the grainy image of the brick wall behind the Riverside Apartments. His living room was suffocatingly quiet, the silence pressing against his eardrums like deep water. With a jagged intake of breath, he pressed the key. The recording resumed. The tinny speakers crackled to life, picking up the ambient hum of the Honda's idle and the muffled rustle of clothing. "I shouldn't be here," Riley's voice murmured through the static. Yet, there was no regret in her tone. It was a soft, yielding surrender. "But you are," the man replied. His voice was close to the microphone, vibrating with a quiet, undeniable confidence. "You always come back, Riley, even when you try to pretend you won't." Then it happened. Riley laughed. It wasn't the tired, obligatory chuckle she offered Grant when he tried to lighten the mood after a brutal 14-hour shift. It wasn't the strained, polite laugh she gave the abrasive customers at the Sunrise Cafe. It was a bright, breathless, unburdened sound. It was the laugh of a woman who felt entirely seen, entirely alive. Grant recognized it instantly. It was the exact sound she had made during their first year together, before the crushing weight of their financial reality had ground her spirit into dust. To hear it resurrected for another man felt like a physical knife twisting between his ribs. "You're impossible, Blake," she said, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. Blake. The name echoed in the dark, cramped living room. Grant searched his exhausted memory, mentally filtering through the regulars at the diner, the neighbors, the delivery drivers. The name meant nothing to him, but the way Riley said it, with a familiarity that bypassed pleasantries and went straight to the bone, spoke volumes. "I missed you," Blake said, the audio picking up the distinct sound of a hand sliding against the worn fabric of the passenger seat. "It drives me insane knowing you go back to that miserable duplex every night, playing house with a guy who smells like cheap cooking oil." Grant flinched, his hands gripping the edges of the coffee table, so hard his knuckles ached. He waited for Riley to defend him. He waited for his wife to remind the stranger of their vows, of the 7 years they had spent building a life, however flawed it was. Instead, there was only a heavy, weighted sigh from the speakers. "Don't talk about Grant," she whispered, though the reprimand was entirely devoid of heat. He's safe. He's a good man. It's not his fault." "Safe isn't what you need," Blake fired back softly. "You need this. Tell me you don't need this." The microphone caught a sharp intake of breath from Riley, followed by the unmistakable, wet sound of a deep, desperate kiss. The fabric rustled violently. The heavy, syncopated breathing filled Grant's living room, stripping away every illusion he had ever held about his marriage. They were not just talking. The confined space of the Honda had become a sanctuary for a hunger Riley had completely hidden from him. 8 years, Riley?" Blake murmured against her, his voice muffled. 8 years, and you still fit perfectly right here. You were mine before you were ever his." The blood drained entirely from Grant's face. 8 years. He had been married to Riley for 7. This man, this Blake, was not a new mistake born from the exhaustion of their blue-collar life. He was a ghost from a past Grant knew nothing about. Grant had spent 7 years breaking his back to provide for a woman who had simply settled for safety, while keeping her heart anchored to a ghost. Grant reached out and slammed the laptop shut. The sudden darkness of the room was absolute, but it offered no comfort. The truth was out, bleeding into the very foundation of his home, and there was no way to wash it clean. Friday morning at the Sunrise Cafe was a chaotic symphony of clinking silverware, shouting waitresses, and the relentless sizzle of bacon grease. For 7 years, this abrasive noise had been Grant's anchor, the soundtrack to his honest, blue-collar life. Today, it was a specialized form of psychological torture. He stood behind the flat-top grill, flipping hash browns with a mechanical, deadened rhythm. The heat radiating off the iron was blistering, but Grant felt nothing except a cold, hollow void expanding in his chest. Through the rectangular pass-through window, he watched Riley. She was balancing 3 heavy porcelain plates on her left arm, pouring coffee from a glass carafe with her right, and flashing a strained, polite smile at a booth full of local mechanics. She looked genuinely exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were prominent, her posture slightly hunched beneath the physical weight of their financial burdens. Safety. That was the word she had used in the car. Grant scraped the grill violently, the harsh metal-on-metal sound grounding his spiraling thoughts. His mind flashed back to their first year in the cramped duplex. They had spent a rainy Friday night sitting on the bare, peeling linoleum floor, eating cheap takeout because they couldn't afford a dining table. Riley had leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand resting flat against his chest. "We're going to build something real, Grant," she had whispered in the dark. "I don't care how hard it is. You're my rock. I'm never letting go." He had believed her with every fiber of his being. He had taken those words and used them as fuel to burn through double shifts, to endure the oil burns on his forearms and the chronic, stabbing ache in his lower back. He genuinely thought they were digging themselves out of poverty together, side by side. Now he knew the devastating truth. She hadn't been holding on to him because she believed in their future. She was holding onto a life raft because she was drowning in the wake of losing Blake. "Grant, I need 2 over easy and a side of rye stat." Riley's voice snapped him back to the suffocating heat of the kitchen. She slapped a green paper ticket onto the metal rail above the window. Her forehead was beaded with sweat, a stray lock of dull brown hair plastered to her cheek. She looked at him, offering a quick, tired smile. The perfect, practiced smile of a dedicated wife sharing the trenches with her husband. It took every ounce of physical restraint Grant possessed not to reach across the metal counter, grab her by the faded collar of her apron, and scream the name Blake into her face. He wanted to shatter the heavy diner mugs. He wanted to demand how she could stand there, wearing the mask of a weary martyr, when he knew exactly what she sounded like, breathless and laughing in the passenger seat of their battered Honda. Instead, Grant cracked 2 eggs onto the oiled iron. "Coming right up," he said. His voice was flat, hollow, unrecognizable even to himself. Riley paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she wiped her hands on a towel. "You okay? You look pale. Did you sleep at all last night?" She reached out, her fingertips grazing his bruised knuckles. The touch, which had once been his only source of comfort, now felt like a localized burn. He thought of those same hands tracing the worn upholstery of the Civic, reaching for a ghost from 8 years ago. Grant pulled his hand back sharply under the guise of grabbing a clean spatula. "Just tired," he lied, effortlessly mirroring the excuse she had weaponized against him for months. "Just a long shift. We'll sleep in on Sunday," she promised softly, entirely oblivious to the fact that the man looking back at her was already gone. She turned on her heel and rushed back to the dining floor, seamlessly re-entering the performance. Grant flipped the eggs, the yolks trembling. He could have confronted her then and there. He could have blown their lives apart in front of the morning regulars. But the dashcam audio had only given him fragments. He knew she was meeting Blake, but he didn't know the exact routine, the depth of the betrayal, or where to find them. If he struck now, she would lie her way out again. He needed the rest of the puzzle. He had to keep wearing his own mask until he caught them in the light. The duplex was silent, save for the uneven rattling of the kitchen refrigerator. It was 3 a.m. on Sunday. Riley was asleep in the bedroom, entirely unaware that the man sitting at the warped formica table was no longer the husband she thought she had successfully manipulated. Grant sat hunched over his battered laptop, a cheap yellow legal pad illuminated by the single bulb above the stove. He had spent the last 2 nights systematically tearing through the DCIM folders on the microSD card. He wasn't just a heartbroken man anymore. He was a forensic auditor of his own ruined life. He drew a harsh line down the center of the paper. On the left side, he wrote Riley's schedule. On the right, the dashcam timestamps. The betrayal, he realized with a sickening clarity, wasn't chaotic or born of a momentary lapse in judgment. It was horrifyingly methodical. He tracked the unaccounted mileage. He tracked the ambient noise of the tires transitioning from asphalt to gravel. He found 3 separate recordings over the past month. All of them occurred on Thursday afternoons. Thursdays, the day Grant worked a brutal open-to-close double shift prepping the kitchen for the weekend rush. The day Riley supposedly took the Honda to the wholesale supply warehouse across town to buy bulk coffee and cheap cleaning supplies to save them a few dollars. Grant clicked on a file dated 2 weeks prior. The audio hissed through the cheap speakers, the heavy thud of the passenger door closing. "You smell like vanilla," Blake's voice murmured through the static. "And you smell like stale beer and cigarettes." Riley shot back, though the affection in her voice was thick and undeniable. "Did you wait inside?" "It's 90 degrees out, Riley." "Of course I waited inside." Jimmy had the AC blasting and the Cubs game on. Grant paused the audio, his finger hovering over the spacebar. "Jimmy." The name clicked into place like a key turning in a rusted lock. Jimmy was the daytime bartender at the Blue Moon Bar, a dilapidated dive joint situated near the county line, about 6 miles from the cafe. It was a haven for day drinkers, off-duty mechanics, and people who didn't want to be found. More importantly, it had a sprawling gravel parking lot hidden behind a thick row of overgrown pine trees, the perfect place to hide a dented blue Civic. Grant resumed the playback, his chest tight. "Same time next week?" Blake asked, the sound of the Honda's engine turning over masking the shift of his weight in the seat. "Always," Riley answered softly. "Thursday at 3. Don't be late." Grant stared at the yellow legal pad. The blue ink on the paper felt like a death warrant. Thursday, 3 p.m. The blue moon. He had the coordinates. The ghost from 8 years ago finally had a physical location. A sick, cold calm settled over him, freezing the frantic panic that had plagued him for days. He looked at the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. For months, Riley had complained about the grueling Thursday traffic to the warehouse, using it as an excuse to lie on the couch while Grant rubbed her aching feet and promised her things would get better. She had actively weaponized his empathy to subsidize her affair. She had let him bleed himself dry over a hot grill while she parked behind a dive bar to relive her past. He closed the laptop, the screen going black, casting him in shadows. He didn't feel the urge to scream or throw things. He felt hollowed out, replaced by a rigid, mechanical purpose. Today was Sunday. He had 4 days to figure out how to look his wife in the eye, knowing exactly where he would be meeting her on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Thursday afternoon descended upon Chicago with a heavy, suffocating humidity that made the air feel like warm water in the lungs. For the first time in 4 years, Grant Foster was not behind the grill at the Sunrise Cafe. He had called his manager at dawn, citing a violent stomach bug, a lie that tasted like ash on his tongue. By 2:45 p.m., he was parked behind a rusted industrial dumpster at the far edge of the Blue Moon Bar's gravel lot. He was sitting in the cab of Brian's battered Ford F-150. He had borrowed the neighbor's truck under the pretense of hauling an old mattress to the dump. Riley would immediately recognize the dented blue Civic, but she would never look twice at a rusted farm truck. The heat inside the cab was blistering. Sweat stung Grant's eyes and soaked the collar of his shirt, but he couldn't roll down the windows. He couldn't risk the noise. He just sat there, his hands gripping the cracked steering wheel until his knuckles ached, staring at the side entrance of the dive bar. At exactly 3:02 p.m., the familiar blue Honda Civic crunched into the parking lot. Grant stopped breathing. He watched as the car pulled into a shaded spot beneath a dying pine tree, far away from the road. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and Riley stepped out. She wasn't wearing her faded, grease-stained work uniform. She was wearing a simple, dark blue sundress, one Grant hadn't seen since their second anniversary. Her hair, usually tied up in a severe, practical knot, was down, falling softly over her shoulders. She stood by the car, checking her reflection in the side mirror, smoothing the fabric over her hips with a nervous, excited energy that Grant hadn't witnessed in half a decade. She didn't look like an exhausted woman crushed by the weight of poverty. She looked radiant. She looked alive. She walked toward the heavy wooden door of the bar and disappeared inside. Grant remained in the sweltering truck, paralyzed by a sickening cocktail of adrenaline and despair. The dashboard clock mocked him as the minutes dragged by. Every second they spent inside that bar was a physical blow to his chest. His mind raced with the agonizing possibilities of what they were doing, what they were saying, how she was looking at him in the dim, neon-lit corners of the dive. He wanted to turn the key. He wanted to throw the truck into reverse, tear out of the gravel lot, and drive until the gas tank was completely dry. He wanted to go back to the misery of his ignorance, where the only problem in his life was the impending electric bill. But he didn't move. He had to see it through. At 4:10 p.m., the heavy wooden door swung open, spilling the harsh afternoon sunlight into the dark interior of the bar. Riley walked out first. Right behind her was a man. He didn't look like a wealthy executive or a smooth-talking stranger. He wore faded denim, scuffed work boots, and a plain gray shirt. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a relaxed, easy posture that commanded the space around him. Blake, the ghost in the flesh. Grant watched, his heart hammering a violent, fatal rhythm against his ribs, as Blake reached out and caught Riley's hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away out of guilt or fear of being seen. She leaned her weight into him naturally, her shoulder pressing against his chest. Blake lowered his head, whispering something near her ear, and Riley tilted her head back. letting out that same bright, breathless laugh Grant had heard on the dashcam. Their fingers intertwined seamlessly, perfectly, as they walked slowly back toward the blue Civic. It was the profound comfort in their body language that finally broke Grant. This wasn't a frantic, sordid affair born out of desperation. This was an established, deeply rooted intimacy. They moved together like two people who had never been apart. As Grant sat suffocating in the heat of the borrowed truck, watching his wife unlock the car she shared with her husband to let her lover inside, he realized the most devastating truth of all. He was the other man in his own marriage. The heavy iron door of the F-150 creaked in violent protest as Grant pushed it open. He stepped down onto the loose gravel. The sound of his heavy work boots crushing the stones was deafening in the stagnant, humid afternoon air. Riley had her hand on the passenger door handle of the blue Civic. She froze. She turned her head, squinting against the harsh glare of the Chicago sun. For a fraction of a second, there was only mild confusion on her face. Why was their neighbor's rusted farm truck parked at a dive bar? Then, her eyes tracked downward, locking onto Grant. All the radiant, vibrant energy she had carried out of the blue moon vanished instantly. Her face went entirely ashen, the blood draining so fast she swayed slightly on her feet. Her hand dropped from the door handle as if the metal had suddenly turned molten. "Grant?" she breathed. The word barely carried over the distance between them, but he read the terrified shape of her lips. Blake turned. He sized Grant up immediately, taking in the cheap jeans, the exhausted posture, the dark circles under his eyes. Blake didn't step back. He didn't cower. Instead, he subtly shifted his weight, placing himself half a step in front of Riley. It was a fiercely protective, territorial gesture. It made Grant physically sick to his stomach. Grant walked toward them. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no sudden downpour of rain to mask the tragedy of the moment. There were only the cicadas buzzing relentlessly in the dying pine trees and the suffocating smell of hot dust and stale beer. He stopped 10 feet away. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. The exhaustion of the past 7 years seemed to crash down on him all at once, far heavier than the summer heat. "You told me you were at the warehouse," Grant said. His voice was frighteningly calm, entirely hollowed out. "You told me we couldn't afford to fix the water heater because the bulk napkins were too expensive this month." Riley took a trembling step forward from behind Blake, her hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. "Grant, please. What are you doing here? Let's just go home. We can go home and talk about this." "Talk about what?" Grant asked, his eyes shifting to the tall man standing beside her. "About him? Or about the fact that you've been using the car I fixed to sleep with him, while I burn my hands on a grill for 12 hours a day to pay our rent?" Blake's jaw tightened. "Listen, man. Don't." Grant cut him off, his voice slicing cleanly through the heavy air. He didn't raise his volume, but the absolute zero temperature of his tone made Blake close his mouth. Grant looked back at his wife, the woman he had shared a bed with for nearly 3,000 nights. "Who is he, Riley? Really?" Riley started to cry. It wasn't the manipulative, defensive crying from their kitchen a week ago. It was the ugly, hyperventilating panic of a woman watching her meticulously constructed double life burn to the ground in the middle of a gravel lot. "Grant, please don't do this here. Not like this." "Who is he?" Grant repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. It was Blake who answered. He didn't look ashamed. He looked almost relieved that the ghost story was finally over.
"I'm Blake Storm.
We were engaged 8 years ago." The words hung in the humid air, lethal and absolute. 8 years ago. The timeline Grant had agonized over finally locked into place with a sickening snap. Riley hadn't met Grant and fallen in love. She had met Grant exactly 1 year after her engagement to Blake fell apart. She was broken, drowning in the wreckage of a profound heartbreak, and Grant had simply been the first solid piece of ground she could cling to. He hadn't been her partner. He had been her triage. He was the safe, boring harbor she used to weather the storm until Blake came back. Grant looked at his wife, searching her tear-streaked face for a denial, a desperate lie, Anything to prove that their 7 years of marriage meant more than a holding pattern. But Riley just stood there, her face buried in her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the suffocating heat. She didn't deny it, because it was the truest thing that had been spoken between them in years. They didn't speak in the parking lot of the Blue Moon. Grant had simply turned his back on them, climbed into the sweltering cab of the borrowed F-150, and driven away. Riley had followed him 30 minutes later in the blue Civic. Now, the duplex was entombed in a suffocating twilight. Grant sat at the chipped Formica kitchen table, the single overhead bulb casting harsh, uncompromising shadows across his face. He hadn't bothered to turn on the air conditioning. The oppressive heat of the room matched the heavy, deadened weight in his chest. The front door clicked open. Riley stepped inside. She was still wearing the blue sundress, but the radiant energy she had carried out of the bar was entirely gone. She looked hollowed out, her shoulders slumped, her eyes red and swollen. She walked into the kitchen and stopped a few feet away from the table, hovering like a ghost in her own home. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the uneven rattling of the cheap refrigerator. There was no screaming. The anger Grant had anticipated feeling was absent, replaced by a profound, paralyzing exhaustion. "How long has he been back?" Grant asked. His voice was flat, devoid of any accusatory heat. Riley wrapped her arms around her own waist, staring at the peeling linoleum floor. 6 months. He got a job at the new development out in Naperville. 6 months, Grant repeated softly. He looked at his hands, resting flat on the table. The knuckles were perpetually bruised, the skin scarred from years of popping grease and hot iron. "And the Thursday afternoons? Started 4 months ago," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Grant, I swear to God I tried to stop it. I told him I was married. I told him we were building a life. But you didn't want to build a life with me, Riley," Grant interrupted quietly. He finally looked up, meeting her tear-filled eyes. "You just wanted a place to rest." Riley flinched as if he had struck her. She sank into the chair opposite him, covering her face with her hands. The ugly, ragged sound of her weeping filled the small kitchen. "He broke me, Grant," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a desperate, broken confession. 8 years ago, he was a mess. He drank. He couldn't keep a job. He completely shattered my heart. And then I met you." She dropped her hands, looking at him with a terrifying, devastating honesty. "You were so steady. You worked so hard. You never yelled. You never disappeared for days at a time. You were safe, Grant. I was so exhausted from hurting, and you were just good. I thought if I married a good man, I could learn to love the life." The words were a physical autopsy of their marriage. Grant felt the last remaining tether to his past snap. He hadn't won her heart. He had merely been her sanctuary. He was the sturdy, unglamorous shelter she hid inside until the storm passed. And now that Blake was sober, employed, and back in town, the shelter was no longer required. "I gave you everything I had," Grant said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "I worked 14-hour shifts so you could sleep in. I wore shoes with holes in the soles so we could pay the heating bill. I thought we were surviving together, but I was just subsidizing your waiting period." "That's not true," Riley pleaded, reaching across the table. Her fingers brushed his arm, but he pulled away instantly, the contact making his skin crawl. "I cared about you, Grant. I really did." "You cared about what I provided," Grant corrected her, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You cared that I kept the lights on while you kept a piece of yourself saved for him." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone at the table. There was nothing left to fight for. The marriage hadn't been murdered in the parking lot of a dive bar today. It had been dead the moment she said her vows. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 4 months since the afternoon Brian had sat at the counter and dismantled Grant's world. The Sunrise Cafe was closed. The neon open sign was dark, and the dining room was illuminated only by the harsh, yellow street lamps filtering through the grease-stained front windows. The heavy hum of the commercial refrigerators was the only sound left in the cavernous space. Grant sat in the corner booth, the cracked red vinyl cold beneath him. He was not wearing his apron. His hands rested flat on the laminate tabletop, the skin still calloused but slowly losing the deep, ingrained scent of burnt onions and old cooking oil. He had quit the diner 2 weeks ago, taking a warehouse job on the south side. Paid less, but the air there didn't smell like his dead marriage. The front door clicked open. Riley stepped inside, the tiny brass bell above the frame ringing with a hollow, cheerful finality. She walked toward the booth. She looked entirely different from the woman who used to balance heavy trays of porcelain plates. The perpetual, bruising exhaustion that had shadowed her eyes for 7 years was gone, replaced by a quiet, apprehensive sorrow. She wore a simple gray sweater, clutching her worn leather purse tightly against her chest. She slid into the booth opposite him. Between them lay a thick manila envelope. "You changed the locks on the duplex," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the refrigerators. "My name is the only one on the lease now," Grant replied. His tone was not cruel, just emptied of any remaining warmth. "The landlord said it was standard protocol." Riley nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the table. She didn't argue. She hadn't fought him on anything since the afternoon in the parking lot of the Blue Moon. When the illusion of their shared struggle shattered, so did her right to claim any part of the life he had built for them. She had moved her things out in a single weekend while he was working a double shift, slipping quietly back into Blake Storm's orbit. Grant reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cheap black ballpoint pen. He placed it on top of the manila envelope. "My lawyer highlighted where you need to sign, page 4 and the bottom of page 7. It's a clean break. No alimony, no division of assets. Mostly because there are no assets to divide." Riley reached for the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The stark, black text on the crisp white paper looked entirely out of place in the grimy diner, where they had spent the majority of their adult lives bleeding for a future that was never going to happen. She flipped to page 4. She picked up the pen. For a long moment, the tip hovered over the dotted line. Grant watched her, feeling the phantom ache of the 7 years they had spent pretending to be a team. He remembered the nights they had eaten cold soup out of a can, promising each other that the sacrifice was worth it. A single drop of water hit the paper. Grant watched as the tear landed perfectly beside the signature line, soaking into the cheap paper and slightly warping the printed text beneath it. Riley didn't sob. She simply lowered her head, the quiet, devastating realization of what she had thrown away finally settling over her. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name, the blue ink bleeding slightly into the damp edge of her tear. She flipped to page 7 and signed again. It took less than 10 seconds to legally sever 3,000 days of shared history. She slid the papers back across the laminate table, avoiding his eyes. "I really did want it to work, Grant," she whispered, her voice thick and broken. "I wanted to be the woman who deserved how hard you worked for us." Grant gathered the papers, slipping them back into the envelope. He looked around the dark diner, at the empty counter and the cold iron grill. He felt the profound, bitter weight of acceptance settle into his bones. He stood up, sliding the envelope under his arm. He looked down at the woman who had used him as a shelter from her own storm. "We survived the poverty, Riley," Grant said quietly, the finality of his words echoing in the empty space. "We just couldn't survive the truth." He turned and walked out the glass door, stepping into the cool Chicago night, leaving her sitting alone in the dark.